Starting off in our number 5 spot, 7. Between 1975 and 1989, there were a total of 7 unsolved murders in the Saga Prefecture. All of these cases were believed to be connected, as the victims were all killed in the same way. They were all strangled to death, they were all females, and 6 of the 7 victims went missing on a Wednesday. The only thing that was different about them was the age range, which was between 11 to 50 years old. There was only ever one man who was arrested and tried for these murders, but he was later found innocent, which leaves all of these murders officially unsolved. On top of that, the statute of limitations has expired for all of the victims except for the final 3. And at number 4, the Kumatori chain. In 1992, between the months of June and July, 5 members of a motorcycle gang committed suicide within 0.7 miles of each other in Osaka. Packed suicides aren't exactly uncommon, but after examining the bodies, the police were convinced that this was staged to look like a packed suicide and that foul play was involved. 3 of the victims in particular gave them reasons to believe these deaths were against their will. For example, one of the young men had horizontal rope marks around his neck, whereas if this was a suicide, there would have been diagonal marks. Next, one of the girls was found with stab wounds on her neck and chest. And for the 3rd victim, he was found hanging from a chestnut tree, but police say there was no clear indication on how he climbed the tree prior to his death. It was then brought up that several of these young gang members reported being stalked at some point before the suicide, but no one was ever interviewed. And at number 3, icebox murders. Back on June 23rd of 1965, a patrolman in Houston made a standard stop-in visit at the home of Fred and Wenda Rogers. This patrolman named Charles Bullock said the couple were so nice and sweet that he just wanted to stop in and say hello. Once there, he went inside but noticed the house was empty. He was about to leave but then noticed an odd smell coming from the fridge, so he opened it to check it out. About this, he said, "I opened up a refrigerator and seen nothing but meat stacked in it. My partner standing next to me made the comment that it looked like somebody had butchered a hog. We didn't know it was a body until we got ready to close the refrigerator and we could see the head down in the bottom of the vegetable bin." After this murder was reported, an examiner came in and revealed that the couple had been killed a week before they were placed in the refrigerator. Fred had his head crushed in and his insides flushed down the toilet, and Edwina had been brutally beaten and shot. So who would want to do this to a sweet elderly couple? Well, the killer was never found, but the prime suspect was always the couple's 43-year-old son, Charles. And that was basically because he disappeared without a trace after the murder. Charles also became a suspect after one of his former friends came forward, claiming Charles was physically and emotionally abused by his parents from a young age. It's also said that Charles owned the house his parents were living in and that they constantly took out loans in his name. Coming in at number 2, Bear Brook murders. The Bear Brook murders, also referred to as Allenswood 4, are 4 unidentified female murder victims. Their decomposed, beaten bodies were found in trash bags in 1985 and 2000 in New Hampshire in the Bear Brook State Park. When found, all the girls were either partially or completely skeletonized. They were believed to have died between 1977 and 1985. The children's faces were reconstructed several times by sketch artists. For years, no one had come forward claiming to know the names of these victims, and the killer was unknown. In 2017, investigators announced that they believed a man named Terry Peter Rasmussen was the killer. DNA actually confirmed that he was the father of 2 of the 4 girls, but nothing was ever proven, and he was convicted of a different murder and died in prison in 2010. And in at number 1, the Grimes sisters. This story takes place in Chicago. One day in December of 1956, 2 sisters, 15-year-old Barbara and 13-year-old Patricia, went to see the new Elvis movie, Love Me Tender, but they never made it home after the movie. This turned into one of the biggest missing persons cases in Chicago history. Everyone was out looking for them. Hundreds of police officers were assigned full time to search for the missing sisters. Even Elvis himself sent out a message asking for them to return safely to their family. Sadly, a month later, their naked, lifeless bodies were found dumped on the side of a road behind a guardrail. To this day, no one knows who killed them. An autopsy report was able to show that the girls were murdered within 5 hours after their last confirmed sighting. Many people reported seeing the girls alive in the weeks following their disappearance, but all of these leads just led police to dead ends. The autopsy report also showed that both girls died from secondary shock.
Number 5, Robert Fisher. Robert Fisher was a man living in Arizona with his wife and 2 children, living quietly. He had worked as a surgical technician and had previously attempted to become a Navy SEAL. He was an avid outdoorsman, an expert hunter, angler, and camper, and found himself frustrated that his children didn't quite share this love of the outdoors with him. Fisher did all he could to present himself as an all-American, white picket fence, nuclear family man, but the truth was far more complicated than that. A child of divorce, Fisher had intense issues regarding separation separations. He and his wife fought constantly over everything, and reports from friends say that he was cruel, controlling, and manipulative to her during their marriage, refusing to let her decorate the house how she wanted, berating her constantly, and so forth. As well, he didn't socialize much outside of his family and was described as a loner. In late 2001, his wife Mary Fisher had had enough, and after nearly 20 years of marriage, was planning on filing for a divorce. On April 9th, 2001, neighbors would overhear a loud argument from the Fisher property. Later that night, the property would explode, burst into flames. Firefighters found inside the property the bodies of Mary Fisher alongside the Fisher son and daughter. Mary had been and the other victims slashed. Robert Fisher himself was not recovered at the site. Robert was thought to have set off the explosion in his own home intentionally as a way of burying his evidence and his tracks, and is thought to have fled entirely, hoping to begin again under a new identity. The thought process from police being he was terrified of Mary leaving him and afraid of repeating the childhood trauma of his mother's divorce. He saw fit to end the lives of his family rather than put them through that experience. Now, friends of Fisher had noted that there had actually been a pattern of worrying behavior before this. Allegedly, on one hunting trip after successfully bagging an elk, Fisher took the blood from the exit wound and smeared it all over his face. Another occasion describes him sneaking up on a family at a picnic to scare them by firing off shotgun rounds into the air, or an altercation in which he fatally a neighborhood dog for attacking his dog, although the police had suspected there was foul play. Fisher was never found, and police aren't even sure if he's still alive. One detective working the case said, "Maybe this is all we'll ever get. Maybe this is the best we've got, knowing he did it and never finding him again." And my ghouls and goblins, if it's scary stuff you're looking for, Top 5 Scary's gotta be one of the top 5 best places to watch scary videos. Ghosts, cryptids, real crimes, aliens, we got it all. Take a look through the cursed archives and see where it takes you. Now let's keep going. Number 4. Richard Lynn Bear. Richard Lynn Bear is an interesting exception on this list, as he's the only one of these fugitives who actually was caught. Now the problem with this is that he was not caught for very long. Didn't really take, as he escaped from jail shortly after being apprehended. Richard was wanted for the death of Sherry Hart, a divorcee and young mother who was waiting for a date on January 15th, 1984. Her date had stood her up, and she changed her evening plans to go out and have fun with high school friends Jeffrey Burgess and one Richard Lynn Bear. However, the evening would take an extremely dark turn when Bear would make an advance at Sherry Hart. She rebuked him, and infuriated and incensed, Richard bashed her with the butt of a handgun and ordered that Burgess drive them about an hour and a half away into the woods. Lynn Bear then dumped Sherry out of the vehicle in the woods, leaving her bleeding heavily. Burgess had told police he'd acted under the threat of his life, as Bear had told him he would see to it that Burgess died if he said anything about what had happened that night. However, Burgess was more than willing to cooperate with the police, leading them to finding Hart's remains and arresting both Bear and Burgess for the crime. However, Burgess would escape days before being tried from the small-town county jail, where he fled, adding him to the FBI's most wanted list for his crimes and unlawful flight to avoid persecution. As of this recording, the trail had gone completely cold, and Lynn Bear was never found again and is still wanted. Burgess passed away at the age of 46, having spent most of his life in and out of prison on various unrelated charges.
And at number 3, Yuki Onishi. Yuki was a 5-year-old girl who disappeared during a celebration of Greenery Day on April 29, 2005. To celebrate this Japanese holiday, she and her family, along with about 60 other people, went to a bamboo shoot digging event. Yuki was digging up bamboo shoots with some of the other kids and went to show her mother the first one she found, and then she wandered off back into the forest to find some more. After 20 or so minutes passed, her mother realized that she was not with the other kids. Her mother got the other adults to help her look for her daughter. A few minutes later, after they couldn't find her, they called the police, who also contacted the fire department for extra assistance. They even brought a police dog to try and track her scent. The dog reached a spot in the nearby forest and then stopped. 4 other dogs were brought in, and all of them led the search party to the exact same spot. It's as though she just vanished. On top of the dogs and the police department, 3,000 people helped search for her, but there were no clues to go off of. There were no clothing shards, no blood, there weren't even any footprints to go off of. Still to this day, no trace of Yuki has been found. Coming in at number 2, Inokashira Park. Back in 1994, on April 23rd, a garbage bag was found by a cleaning staff member of Tokyo's Inokashira Park. The staff member noticed a horrible smell coming from the bag. She assumed it was raw fish. But when her colleague went to open the bag, she glanced inside and saw a human ankle. But that wasn't all. Along with the ankle, there were 24 pieces of human flesh, including 2 hands, 2 feet, and a shoulder. To make this case even weirder, if that's even possible, all of the parts were completely drained of blood, and each piece of flesh was cut out at exactly 20 centimeters. The police were called in, an autopsy was performed. However, the cause of death was deemed unknown. Also, a third of the body, including her head, were never found. 3 days after the body parts were discovered, they were identified as belonging to 35-year-old architect named Sichi Kawamura. He was last seen on April 21st, so 2 days before the body parts were discovered, and lived 5 minutes from the park. The police were determined to find this man's killer. They even questioned thousands of people. During these interviews, they found out that one witness saw 2 suspicious men walking in the park carrying a plastic bag around 4 a.m. on the day the body was found. Police assumed that he was struck by a car and that the killers cut him up to get rid of the body. But that's just speculation, and to this day, this case remains unsolved. And in at number 1, Baby on Board. This is a really messed up and disgusting story. Back in 1988, on March 18th, a man returned home to his apartment in Nagoya. Oddly, when he got to his front door, he noticed it was unlocked and all the lights were off. Once inside, he changed his clothes and began to get ready for bed. It was then that he heard a baby crying. He followed the sound and came across the mutilated body of his 27-year-old pregnant wife with his now newborn son laying at her feet. His wife was bound and strangled to death. After she was dead, it was suspected that the killer then proceeded to cut her stomach open and deliver the baby. He even cut the umbilical cord. The infant somehow survived, but no one ever found out who committed this horrible crime. The police came to investigate, and they believed that the wife was caught off guard in her home after the intruder broke in through the front door. After a short struggle, the intruder wrapped an electrical cord around the woman's neck and suffocated her. He then cut a vertical 38-centimeter slit in her belly and removed the live baby. He cut the umbilical cord, took some money from the woman's purse, and then left. Her husband didn't return home until hours later. Upon inspection of her body, it was noticed that something had been crammed into the now empty cavity in her stomach. It turns out the intruder put a phone and car keys into the hole in the woman's stomach where the baby used to be. While their story was told, the names of this husband and wife were never publicly released by the police.
Number 5, the Servant Girl Annihilator. I can't believe I just said those words. The Servant Girl Annihilator. I can't believe that's the real name newspapers went with to call this guy. I know not everyone's gonna be able to get a nickname like Jack the Ripper, but you can't go around calling criminals stuff like the Servant Girl Annihilator. You're just gonna inflate their ego. You're making him sound like he's a Dark Souls boss, or he's gonna be jumping in the ring against Hulk Hogan and the Iron Sheik. Anyway, sorry, I had to get this out of the way before we could talk about it. I feel like we just had to address this name. We couldn't just look at that and move on. And you know the wildest part? He doesn't even have the craziest name on this list. Okay, let's get into it. The Servant Girl Annihilator was the nickname of a brutal night stalker who preyed on the streets of Austin, Texas in 1885, a full 3 years before Jack the Ripper would stalk Whitechapel and steal all the fame and fortune in the attacking women at night community. Despite his name, he actually didn't exclusively target women. Unlike his British counterpart, Mr. the Ripper, the SVGA attacked men and women, although he mostly focused his attention on women, and they were all servant girls, which is where the name came from. He ended up slaying 7 women and 1 man, and critically injured 6 women and 2 men on top of that. All of his victims carried out the same way, attacking them whilst they slept in their beds, and then dragging them out into the streets when he was finished with them, usually with a sharp object such as a knife or a needle sticking out of the ear. There was a wild manhunt for the Annihilator, and it's said that in 1885 some 400 men were questioned and interrogated about the identity of the Annihilator. Elected officials apparently refused to believe that it could be the work of one lone psycho, thinking there was a group of men committing these crimes together for Lord knows why. While several men would end up being questioned, no one was ever successfully linked to these brutal crimes. He was never caught, but an increased presence by sheriff's department and citizens forming an armed militia to protect the streets were enough to scare off whoever was doing it into fleeing the area, and eventually the crime stopped. So where did he go? That's the question, because he was never found. There are some who even wonder if perhaps maybe he bought himself a train ticket and found his way to Whitechapel to continue his spree. And my friends, if you're looking for more true crime stories, more rumors, whispers, conspiracies, cryptids, aliens, video games, movies, and whatever else we got, Top 5 Scary has it all. Number 4, Bible John. Everyone on this list has a weird nickname. Everybody. I'm gonna tell you that right now. I'm just gonna spoil that for you. Coming up next on this list is going to be Bible John, who's got a name that is deceptively unassuming. Bible John was an infamous executioner who preyed on women in Glasgow in the late 60s. All of his victims he met at a popular nightclub, the Barrel and Ballroom. He operated for a few years and is confirmed to be connected to at least 3 cases and maybe more. He was subject to one of Scotland's most extensive manhunts. He was the first time a composite sketch in the country was ever used as the front page of the newspaper. All because there were so few details about the case or just who he was. What few tidbits of trivia and information we have on Bible John, his crimes, his motives, and his modus operandus come from one of the victim's sisters, who very briefly shared a taxi with Bible John and her sister daughter on the night of her death. Her very brief witness, it was only a 20-minute trip, was all the information they had to provide investigators to form a psychological profile of him, aiding in the investigation. Now, the name Bible John would stem from his practice of obsessively quoting the Bible and ranting and raving about adultery to his victims before, well, you know. The statement we have with Gene Puttock states that in the short period of time they spent together, he was making nigh constant and frequent references to specific Bible passages and really hammering home how much he hated adulterous women. He preyed on brunette women who all looked fairly similar and found them all at the same nightclub, charming them and then attacking them. Their bodies would later be found naked in the streets with signs of strangulation. The only witness, one Gene Puttock, passed away in 2010, with no more leads and the case having been on ice for nearly 50 years. It's very unlikely Bible John will ever be found anytime soon if he's still out there. Number 3. Frederick Valentich. Our next mysterious case is Frederick Valentich, an Australian pilot, a well-trained aerial ace. He had 150 hours of manned flight experience and was permitted to fly alone, provided it was in good weather conditions. He also had a love of extraterrestrial life, a deep desire to find that unknown above. Well, Valentich might have got his wish. Tragically, it might have cost him his life. The year was 1978. Frederick Valentich was performing a 125 nautical mile training flight flying to a small landmass called Kings Island. While at 4,500 feet in the air, Valentich thought he had seen something with him. The Melbourne Flight Service insisted that there wasn't anything in the air with him, but Frederick radioed back and said that there was something on his tail. He claimed that he saw something glowing with 4 repeating bright lights and was rushing past him, and he described it as shiny, metallic, and chrome and looking like a small manned craft. Now, unsure what was happening, Valentich on radio to ground control told them that he was experiencing engine troubles inexplicably. Could this strange flying object be the source of these unexpected problems? Valentich complained out about whatever was following him to the Melbourne Flight Service, saying, "It's hovering and it's not an aircraft." Those would be the last words anyone ever heard from Frederick. Minutes after that last transmission, he went silent and the plane, or the mysterious craft, was never found. An intense search revealed nothing. No sign of the man. The only lead was a local farmer alleging that the day Frederick disappeared, he saw what looked like a civilian aircraft seemingly fused with what looked like a saucer. The farmer told authorities he was worried about being dismissed as a crackpot, so he didn't tell anyone what he saw that day. What do you think? Should he have checked his eyes better? Or was he perhaps the last person to see the remnant of Frederick Valentich before he was carried off into who knows what? Number 2. Michael Rockefeller. When Michael Rockefeller was born, he was born with a silver spoon to a lineage of millionaires in the late 1930s. His great-grandfather, one John Rockefeller, is one of the richest men to have ever lived. The Rockefellers had hoped that Michael would follow them in the family business. Michael, however, had other ideas and wanted to use his millions of dollars to goof off and take it easy, which is what most of us would, I think. Michael had wanderlust in his heart and a deep interest in anthropology, specifically focused on Nigerian, Mayan, and Aztec cultures. Michael's father sat on a board of a museum in New York where Michael would discover this passion, hoping to one day open a collection of indigenous art in New York. After some discussions with the Dutch Museum of Ethnology, terrible name, Michael had decided he would set out to the massive island off the coast of Australia, at the time known as Dutch New Guinea. In 1961, he set off to collect the art of the Asmat people who lived there. It would be a one-way trip. The Asmat people that he was going to study were very disconnected from the rest of the world. They had previously seen Dutch colonizers, but otherwise they weren't getting a ton of visitors. The Asmat believed that the land beyond their island was inhabited by spirits, and they saw the Euros and the Americans as supernatural beings that had come over from across the sea. Michael and his team were allowed to study the people, but were banned from purchasing or taking anything, which held a great deal of significance to the Asmat. Nonetheless, Michael was thrilled with everything he'd been finding and could not wait to open his exhibit. In November 1961, Michael was on a boat accompanied by other anthropologists when a sudden squall threw the boat off its course. 12 miles away from the shore, but Michael insisted he could swim for it, and he was never seen again. The Rockefellers would spend the next few months spending a small fortune trying to find Michael, but gave up after never uncovering anything. The case went cold for years, but officers believed that Michael hadn't been lost to the water, but was rather offered as part of a sacrifice. His head chopped off, his flesh eaten, his bones made into weaponry, Fun stuff. An investigator, one Carl Hoffman, uncovered this while filming the Asmat people. He saw a group of men acting out a scene, miming the act of, removing someone's head from the rest of their neck and attacking them with spears. Now, we can't really find this footage, but through interpretation and translation was a stern warning to the other villagers that Hoffman reported. Pop your ears open and take a listen. Don't you tell this story to any other man. I hope you remember it, and you must keep this for us. I hope this is for you and you only. Don't talk to anyone, to other people, or another village. If people question you, don't answer. Don't talk to them because the story is only for you. If you tell it to them, you'll die. Or any other village, because the story is only for us. I probably shouldn't have shared it just then. Now, maybe just scrub that. Number 1, Lars Mittank. Lars Mittank is a young German man who became infamous in 2014 when his disappearance captured the attention of the world. Last seen on airport security footage, he's been called the most famous missing person on YouTube. Wow, isn't that a lovely title? I'd put that right on my resume. In July 2014, Mittank was vacationing in Varna, Bulgaria, I've heard lovely things, with a group of friends. Apparently things were pretty unremarkable until an argument about football at a bar turned into a brawl. You see, Mittank was a Bremen man and he was getting into an argument with some nasty Bayern fans. I actually don't know nothing about German football. Clear that up in the comments. Mittank would suffer a ruptured eardrum and was told to stay on the ground, for flying could damage his ears even further. So Lars decided to stay in Varna just a little bit longer while the rest of the party would return back to Berlin. Now here's where things take a turn for the strange. CCTV footage from the airport shows Lars behaving strangely, for lack of a better word. Dropping his luggage, running in a sprint, hopping a fence, the kind of things you would do if you were running away from somebody. His final texts warned his mother to cancel his credit cards as he believed he was being pursued. This footage was the last time he was ever seen, as he vanished without a trace shortly thereafter. Both German and Bulgarian authorities launched investigations, but nobody found anything. Hospital records turned up nothing, and outside of a few disconnected sightings of alleged hitchhikers which could have matched descriptions, nothing was ever outright confirmed. So what happened? What happened? There are theories. Some speculate perhaps that the medication he was prescribed was causing a psychological breakdown, combined with the paranoia of being attacked and reeling from the attack earlier in the week. The doctor who prescribed that medication, though, noted he never even filed the prescription, and the doctor was perplexed and concerned with the seemingly causeless change of behavior. Number 5, the Dark Watchers. California is oft considered one of the most beautiful states. It's got gorgeous mountains, lush beaches, sunny days. It's practically a paradise. But behind sun-streaked sands at the peaks of the Santa Lucia Mountains lies a dark secret, a mysterious group of shadowy beings watching over the people below. The locals call them Los Vigilantes Oscuros. Los Vigilantes Oscuros, or the Dark Watchers, were first reported during the 18th century by Spanish settlers who arrived there. The stories would describe these tall, featureless specters that would appear for a moment, serving as a warning before someone's imminent disappearance. It was the last thing you'd ever see. Now, these creatures towered over mortals and looked human enough, but were anything but. They stood 10 to 12 feet tall and were said to be draped in cloaks or capes and wore large brimmed hats like that of a witch. Folklore and oral stories describe these creatures as sternly observing, watching over on high, and seemingly only pursuing those who disturb them. But it is said that those who approach these figures vanish into oblivion, never seen again, not even leaving behind a footprint. So what are they? With hundreds of years worth of reports and sightings, surely someone must have some guess as to what scary shadow people are watching you in the mountains. Now, the prevailing and admittedly kind of dull theory is that the Dark Watchers are a symptom of pareidolia, a very common psychological phenomenon in which the human brain attempts to seek out patterns that it recognizes in something weird. It's why our brain often fills in strange details in the sky. If we see something up there, we can see a flying saucer kind of because we want it to be a flying saucer, you know? Our brain fills in the details we think we see. Encounters of Dark Watchers could just be the shadows of swaying trees or creatures darting about in the night and tired eyes mistaking it for something else. But this video is about unsolved paranormal mysteries, and it's more likely this might be a paranormal phenomenon for which there is no comfortable scientific or reasonable explanation. These creatures through the veil exist in a way I just can't understand. So perhaps it's best for now that we follow their example, and you know what? We just watch, we just observe, we take nothing but photos, we leave footprints, I think that's how it goes, and we keep watching Top 5 Scary. The shadow people told me to say that. It's actually crazy, the shadow people also told me that their one wish is they want for you guys out there to like and comment and subscribe and hit that little bell to make sure you get all the videos that we put out. It's weird that they were so specific with their orders, but that's I'm just relaying what they told us. So keep on watching Top 5 Scary, but do all that subscribing business at the end of this video, because otherwise you're gonna miss the rest of the California mysteries I got for you. Number 4, the ghost of Hollywood. The Hollywood sign is probably one of the most iconic landmarks on the West Coast. Instantly you see that and you know you're in La La Land. But did you know it might be haunted by the spirit of a Hollywood starlet who took her life years ago? Beneath the monument to Tinseltown's glitz and glamour lies a dark secret that perhaps would be better left buried. Peg Entwistle was a young actress and a Hollywood hopeful who had a dream, like many before her, to come to Hollywood and become a household name, making it big on the silver screen. She had a small career on Broadway and then traveled to California to make it in the pictures and landed a role in a picture, 13 Women. Now, by the time the film had premiered to test audiences, her role was cut almost entirely, down to 12 women, causing her to fall into a depression. The film released and was neither a commercial or critical hit. Despondent, Entwistle thought there was no hope for her. On September 16, 1932, she left her home to climb the Hollywood sign and cast herself off of the H to the hiking trail below. Now, since then, hikers and visitors to Hollywood's famous landmark have reported strange occurrences around the tourist spot. Hikers claim they can smell strange perfume in the air, thought to be Peggy's favorite. Joggers sometimes claim they see an ethereal woman in 1930s with a sad expression walking down the trail. That could also just be Lana Del Rey though. One park ranger, John Arbogast, claims he sees her almost nightly whenever it's too foggy. Sees her sitting, brooding, forever trapped in the place she could never make her dreams happen. This does give me an idea though, maybe a little way to solve everybody's problems. Maybe somebody makes a movie about the ghost and the Hollywood sign, and then instead of blowing your budget on special effects, you ask her to play the ghost. She gets to star in a big movie. You get to make a movie about ghosts. She might pass on. Everybody wins. Win, 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 win. Just make sure if you make that movie, I produce that, okay? So keep me in the credits. Number 3, Bradford Bishop. Until I can prove that he's dead, I'm going to assume he's still alive. That's the words of Montgomery County Sheriff Raymond Knight, speaking on our next entry, Bradford Bishop. This notorious criminal has been on the FBI's most wanted list for years, and has managed to elude capture this entire time. In fact, he was taken off of the FBI's most wanted list in late 2018 to accommodate more serious fugitives, and FBI had some reason to believe he might not even still be alive. Bradford Bishop was an unusual case, as he was a fairly promising career man with no stains on his record. He was working as a counterintelligence official, a former army serviceman, and he worked as a diplomat. Life seemed to be going fairly well for Mr. Bishop, who fathered 3 children with his wife Annette, where they lived in Bethesda, Maryland. On March 1st, 1976, Bradford was passed over for a promotion at work that he was due for. He left the office a little bit early, telling his secretary he wasn't feeling well that day. He would then drive to his bank, he withdrew a large amount of money, and he went to fill up gas in his car and then to a hardware store to purchase a shovel, pitchfork, and a sledgehammer. Bradford would then return home and ended the lives of his family members one by one. He would carry their bodies into the trunk of his car, where he drove them deep into the swamp nearly 300 miles away, where he buried and lit the bodies ablaze in a shallow grave, burning the remains of his once happy family. There would be a few sightings of Bradford afterwards. He was last seen buying tennis shoes with an unknown woman and a dog March 2nd. On March 18th, his car was discovered by police at an isolated campground all the way over in Tennessee. The contents of the car were unnerving. A blood-soaked blanket, a shotgun, an axe, and the well for the spare tire was soaked in blood. A jury indicted Bradford, and that was the last time any evidence of the case ever emerged. Now, since then, there have been numerous unproven sightings, sporadically appearing throughout Europe mostly, but nothing that has contributed to an arrest. If Bradford Bishop is still alive, he is 86 and has still evaded capture. Number 2, the Freeway Phantom. The Freeway Phantom was the self-given nickname of a serial criminal around Washington, D.C. who has never been identified. He first made himself known in the early 1970s, seemingly taking a page out of the Zodiac's coded puzzling handbook. The Freeway Phantom taunted the police with cryptic messages and puzzles teasing his capture. 18-year-old Brenda Denise Woodard was found dead in November 1971 with a note inside one of her coat pockets. The note read out as follows: This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me if you can. Signed, the Freeway Phantom. The name happened to catch on. There are a few criminals who offer to write their own monikers, but clearly the Freeway Phantom had a brand in mind. Over the course of a 17-month period, 6 similarly aged young black women were found all along the highway, all missing their shoes and all showing visible signs of trauma. Police had been working on what they thought had been promising leads, including an investigation into 2 former police officers who were being convicted of a separate crime. However, none of these investigations ever turned up anything concrete, leading the FBI to take charge of the case in 1974. However, it was around this time that the trail started to go cold, and no more deaths following the Freeway Phantom's MO appeared, luckily. Although tragically for the victims' families, no justice would ever be found either. The investigation is still active in some aspects in Washington, D.C., although given that it's been 5 decades since the first victim was found, it's hard to think that any serious progress might be made on this case. Perhaps the identity of the Freeway Phantom will never come to light, but at the very least, it seems as if the brutal series of crimes had stopped. Number 1. The vending machine. When you were younger, did you ever hear about the urban legend of someone putting poison in candy, or someone putting a razor blade inside of a chocolate or an apple or something and giving it out to trick-or-treaters? Probably have. I mean, I've even talked about it before in a previous video on urban legends. It's the kind of story that you'd hear on a playground and it would scare you and stick with you for life. You tell yourself that kind of thing only happens in the movies, and no one in their right mind would ever go around poisoning unsuspecting people. But that's perhaps because you've never heard of this case. The case of the mysterious vending machine criminal in Japan. This wave started in April of 1985. People around Western Japan, primarily in Tokyo, were dying under mysterious circumstances. The first victim died shortly after purchasing 2 bottles of a popular Japanese soda, Orinamen C. In the next coming weeks, there were 35 cases of mysterious poisonings, all tracked back to Orinamen C purchased at vending machines. At the time of the crime spree, the company producing Orinamen C had been running a promotion where their vending machines would give out a second bottle of the product after purchasing one, and the criminal took advantage of this fact, lacing bottles of the soft drink with a powerful poison, and he placed them inside or on top of the vending machines to deceive consumers into believing that they'd been a winner of the promotion and they got that extra second bottle. Shortly after, police issued citywide warnings across all vending machines to inspect each drink carefully to see if the seal on the bottle cap had been tampered. Of these 35 cases, 12 of them were fatal, making the Orinamen C tampering the deadliest product tampering case in history. Police had absolutely 0 leads, and the nature of the crime made it incredibly difficult to track down, as the bottles had been dispersed seemingly randomly across Western Japan. As well, there did not appear to be any greater motive, no intentional victims. There was nothing to link them together, as the victims that had all been afflicted had been completely random. Police had suggested, though, that they think the suspect was a single agent acting alone, who had meticulously planned the crime. A psychologist suggested possibly that the crime was carried out as a response to Japan's orderly and aggressive work culture, and that this was a lashing out by hurting unsuspecting people that the victim would never have to face. They would get a sense of rush and control, but never have to directly deal with the consequences. Whoever was behind the Orinamen C tampering spree was never caught. There were cases across Tokyo afterwards police suspected might have been copycats, but no leads and no arrests were ever made.
Coming in at 5, D.B. Cooper. Less scary and more baffling is the disappearance of D.B. Cooper. D.B. Cooper is the epithet used to refer to the unidentified man who hijacked a Boeing 727 in the northwest United States between Portland and Seattle on November 24, 1971. He extorted $200,000 in ransom and jumped from the aircraft, parachuting down to the ground. An extensive search was undergone, but the perp was never located or identified. Many theories have been brought about since the disappearance, including that he died in the fall, and another being that he is actually Tommy Wiseau, a personal fave of mine, but definitely the least believable. Decades later and there is still speculation. What do you think happened to this hijacker? Do you think he's alive, or do you think he died when he parachuted out of the plane? Leave us all your thoughts and feelings below. In at 4, Martha Wright. In 1975, married couple Jackson Wright and wife Martha traveled through the Lincoln Tunnel en route to New York City. However, only one of them made it out the other side. Jackson Wright stated that while inside the tunnel, they pulled over to clean the car's windshield that had become blurred from condensation. Jackson cleaned the front while Martha did the back. However, when Jackson turned around, Martha was gone, having mysteriously disappeared. Jackson claimed he never saw or heard anything unusual. She was just gone. No evidence has ever been found. And to this day, no one knows what happened to Martha. The Lincoln Tunnel is now considered to be one of the highest risk terror attacks in the United States due to frequent robberies.
Number 3, the Doodler. Next up on this list is the Doodler. Like everybody else, don't let the goofy name fool you into thinking there is anything silly or funny about this guy. Now, this bizarre nickname would come about from his habit of drawing pictures of his victims before he would attack them. And I guess the drawer or the sketcher or the artist didn't quite roll off the tongue the same way that the Doodler did, and that's the name they went with. The exact body count of the Doodler is unknown, but police believe that it could be anywhere from 6 to 14 victims total in San Francisco, stretching from 1974 to 1975. Several men disappeared from the city's gay community, and more were injured. And part of what made him so hard to identify is that despite the city's historically very liberal and accepting view of the LGBTQ+ community, at the time the larger mainstream whole community hadn't quite got there yet. And so several of the men who would end up surviving an attack were too worried about outing themselves to want to cooperate with the police, leading to very few victims cooperating with the police, meaning there was very little information for any of them to work with, and the criminal was able to successfully elude pursuit. Ironically, for someone named the Doodler, the composite face sketch they had from witnesses is the only real bit of evidence they ever had to work with. However, unlike a lot of the other cases on this list, this one is actually still actively ongoing. There's a $200,000 reward for anyone that has any additional information. And as of 2019, this case is still ongoing, with DNA and fingerprint evidence being used to try to narrow down the ever wide net of potential subjects of interest and hopefully get some closure on a horrible chapter in San Francisco's history. Number 2, the Pickler. Now, I've talked about the Pickler before on this channel, but his story is so horrifying and honestly unbelievable that it's worth repeating at least once. Again, goes without saying, like every single entry else on this list, the Pickler leads you to believe this is going to be a silly story, but wait about a minute, I'll explain why he's called the Pickler and all the pieces will come together and you'll regret clicking on this video. This one's kind of a dark one. The Pickler's real name was Bela Kiss, and he worked as a tinsmith in the early 1900s, living in a humble small village in Hungary. He had been married and he had children, but his wife had left and with her took the children. He moved in a housekeeper who served as his sole faithful companion. His housekeeper would note that he seemed to entertain a plethora of female guests and was never hurting for women's attention, although she didn't talk to any of the guests much. Outside of his women callers, Kiss was actually fairly isolated. He kept to himself mostly, he didn't interact with his neighbors much at all, or the community as a whole, instead preferring to tend to himself and living quietly alone with his housekeeper and his big collection of metal drums. He had a stockpile of metal drums all over his property, and when people would ask about them, he said that he was stockpiling gas. In 1914, Kiss would be conscripted to serve with the Hungarian army and left behind his home to his noble housekeeper. While deployed, Hungarian soldiers were running low on resources, and when they needed gas, some soldiers on patrol saw fit to take from Kiss's collection all over his property. However, when they went to recover the gas, they were shocked to discover what the barrels actually contained. No gas to be found, but instead the bodies of several missing women floating in alcohol in an attempt to preserve or pickle their corpses. See what I mean? Not pleasant even remotely. There were 20 barrels in total, and inside each one was another missing woman. But perhaps most alarmingly of all of this is that they appeared to have been drained of their bodily fluids with punctures in the neck, which sounds made up. As if this guy wasn't scary enough, there's also the very real possibility that he might have been a vampire. Now, upon this discovery, the Hungarian army immediately moved to try and locate and apprehend Bela Kiss, but discovered that that would prove quite difficult, since he had both a very common Hungarian name at the time, and he was also deployed in the middle of the largest conflict the world had ever seen at the time, and was just one more face in a green uniform. Somehow, Kiss learned that he was being pursued and faked his death by leaving behind a corpse in a hospital that had his ID. Kiss fled and was never seen in Europe again. A few scattered sightings would report him throughout New York, but he was never found and eluded capture for the remainder of his days. It's unlikely he's still out there, but you never know. And finally, number 1, the Zodiac. If we're talking about evil people who've managed to elude capture, it might feel a little obvious to put the Zodiac as number 1, you know? But he's also one of the most infamous, strangest, and scariest criminal stories in American history, so it's never a bad story. Well, it is. It's a terrible story, but it's a very interesting one to hear. The Zodiac terrorized California throughout the late 60s and early 70s, personally claiming responsibility for 37 victims. He stole headlines and media attention for for years, as the state was fascinated and terrified by what he would do next, and if he would ever be caught. His exploits have been the subject of a few films and TV, most famously David Fincher's Zodiac, starring Jake Gyllenhaal and Robert Downey Jr., dramatizing the investigation trying to find him unsuccessfully. Although he himself insisted that he left a trail of 37 bodies, the police were only ever able to connect 5 different deaths to the Zodiac. People would be attacked by a lone gunman, with nothing seemingly connecting the cases. Motive, modus, everything was unclear. The case would become legendary when he sent his infamous letters to 3 separate newspapers, containing details that only the real assailant could have possibly known about the crimes, inviting and challenging police to a game to catch him. He sent out a postcard boldly displaying "My name is," and then a blank spot with an invitation to solve one of his puzzles. If you saw the new 2022 Batman movie, Paul Dano's Riddler is directly inspired off the Zodiac, all of his methodology, taunting people, leaving weird riddles at his crime scenes, that sort of stuff. His letters were threatening, taunting, and incomprehensible. The code he wrote in would stump detectives for years, to this day, with only one of his ciphers ever being solved, and it not being nearly enough to connect any dots. The riddle that was solved spelled out a confession of sorts, but it mostly served as the Zodiac gloating about the nature of his crimes and saying that he did it solely because he thought it was fun and that it was the most thrilling, fun thing a man could do. Described it as being better than hunting games or getting your rocks off. He didn't mention whether or not it was better than writing riddles and codes though. Now at the time, obviously they looked into just about everyone they could, and there were several prominent suspects and people of interest, but nothing concrete and final. The rest of his riddles were never solved, and as far as we know, he was never caught. However, in 2018, a private team of investigators was absolutely determined to close the case once and for all, and put an end to one of California's most infamous mysteries. They had identified an 80-year-old Gary Francis Post, who had passed away. He resembled the composite sketches of the Zodiac, and forensic evidence had actually made some compelling arguments that could tie it to being him, but the FBI have denied this claim, and say that they still consider the case open. Will it ever be closed within our lifetime? We may never know, but the one thing that's certain is that we are not going to stop trying until we get some answers. You want my theory? Personally, I think Jack the Ripper is the Zodiac. Number 5. The Ghost Bride of Galvez. To Texans, it's no secret that Hotel Galvez is haunted. The Grand Galvez, as it's known now, first opened its doors in 1911, and since then has been said to be home to all manner of haunting, but the most retold story is that of Audra, the Ghost Bride of Galvez. Audra was a 25-year-old bride-to-be getting married there. Her betrothed was a young sailor who would frequently leave her on her lonesome while he was out on a voyage. During the periods where the sea would separate the two lovers, Audra would rent out room 501, climb out the ladder to the rooftop, and wait on the rooftop turret with love in her heart for her sweetheart to return. Now one day during a catastrophic storm, Audra was told that her fiance's ship capsized, and overcome with grief, Audra took her own life on the roof of the hotel. Tragically, as if this wasn't sad enough, her groom would arrive a few days later, eager to surprise and re-encounter his bride as he'd survived the capsizing. And although he was never able to be with her physically again, if you believe the stories, she might still linger around the premises. Visitors claim that Audra frequents the 5th floor, and in particular, her spirit tends to hang around the matrimonial suite and room 501. Some claim they hear random doors slamming, or strong currents of chills, flickering lights, the usual who's who of a ghost haunting a hotel. Other stories tell of seeing a candle lit on the rooftop, wondering if it's the ghost of Audra still waiting for her beloved to come back to her. The attendants at the Galvez claim that there's difficulties making electronic keys for room 501 since they're prone to malfunction frequently. Visitors to the Galvez go out specifically looking for Audra now, hoping to catch a glimpse of the spirit. If you ever go to Texas, be sure to check it out if you're brave enough. And if you're looking for more freaky stories, true crime, ghosts, cryptids, basically the whole 9 yards, Top 5 Scary has all of that and then some. So click on that bell and click on through and subscribe and find something to scream at. But do that at the end of this video, okay? We got way more mysteries in Texas coming up. Number 4, the Icebox Killer. The Icebox Killer refers to an incredibly grisly crime that haunted Houston, and if you believe the conspiracies, might be entangled in a much larger web of interest. Take a listen to this brutal crime. On June 23, 1965, 2 Houston police officers were sent for a fairly benign wellness check and went to investigate the home of a suburban family, the Rogers, Fred and Edwina, and their son Charles. Edwina's nephew was concerned because he hadn't seen or heard from his aunt in a concerning amount of time. The 2 officers went to check the house and got no response from a knock. A look around in the backyard, they found a makeshift barricade on the back door, which was more than a little suspicious, so they entered the house. One of the 2 detectives opened the fridge instinctively and saw a pile of raw meat in the fridge. The detective dismissed it as boar or pig, and you can probably see where this is going. They opened the vegetable crisper and were disgusted at what they found: the heads of Edwina and Fred Rogers. Police suspected initially that the son Charles had been behind it, but why, no one was particularly sure. Now, here's where this already upsetting strange case gets wild. There are allegations that Charles Rogers was present the day of the JFK assassination, and some allege he was one of the 3 tramps photographed with police escort by Dealey Plaza. The conspiracy alleges that Charles Rogers, who was a former Marine and served in the Office of Naval Intelligence, was involved somehow in the larger assassination plot, and the claim is that somehow his parents discovered his involvement with the conspiracy and he had to silence them and flee. A bold claim, but Charles Rogers was never found. No proof of a body, despite being declared dead. Now, did he vanish? Or was he himself silenced to tie up a loose knot as part of something infinitely larger than himself? We may never truly have the answers for this one. Number 3, D.B. Cooper. Now, our next entry, I would hesitate to call him as evil as the rest of some of these crooks, you know? Sure, he hijacked a plane, sure, he held the entire plane hostage, and sure, he stole $200,000 from the government, but that doesn't mean he's a bad guy. D.B. Cooper's case is one of contemporary crime legends, as all that I just described sounds like he would be FBI public enemy number 1, right? Like they'd be working around the clock to bust this guy. They'd have him within the week. He slipped through authorities' fingers, and to date, D.B. Cooper was never caught. We don't know if that was even his real name or just an epithet he was using for the plane. We don't know anything really too concrete about him. Depending on what your definition of success is, D.B. Cooper could possibly be considered one of the most successful criminals of all time. To get into the nitty-gritty of the details, on November 24th, 1971, a man using the possible alias Dan Cooper boarded a flight to Seattle, and almost as soon as it took off, he passed a note to a flight attendant indicating that he had a with him, and that he demanded that when the plane landed, he trade the passengers on the flight for $200,000 and 2 parachutes. That's a smart man. He didn't want to waste any of that money on parachutes. The note said that if anything funny happened, he would blow the plane up. They complied out of fear, and upon landing, he was given the money by local authorities. Cooper then seized the plane one more time, holding the flight crew hostage with plans to fly to Mexico City. But midway through the flight, Cooper pulled a little point break and jumped out of the plane with all the money with him. And that would be the last time anyone would have ever seen D.B. Cooper. The FBI chased him for years to no avail. Nothing was ever found. No body ever recovered. No suspect ever caught out of a laundry list of people of interest. Some of the bills were recovered, but that's the only piece of evidence. Now, my absolute favorite theory about D.B. Cooper, and it's kinda out there, is that he's legendary cinema director Tommy Wiseau, and that this is where his fortune came from, as the man is shrouded in mystery regarding where his seemingly limitless supply of money comes from and his mysterious origins. Is it completely ridiculous and has no basis in reality? Yes, but it's also hilarious. Now, as for any more likely suspects for Cooper, there were a couple of Special Forces veterans who lined up with physical descriptions who could have been capable of committing the heist, but no concrete charges were ever made, and to date, no trace was ever found. Number 2, the Zodiac. Possibly one of the most infamous cases in American history, the Zodiac was a notorious criminal, famed in equal measures for his slayings and for his chilling obsession and interaction with the police trying to track him. He was made a household name after a Hollywood flick starring Jake Gyllenhaal and Robert Downey Jr. depicting the efforts trying to find him. The Zodiac is known to be responsible for 5 different deaths terrorizing California in the late 60s and early 70s, although he himself claims responsibility for 37 victims. The Zodiac case became legend when he sent his now infamous letters to 3 separate newspapers, providing details only he could have known about the crimes, and challenging the police to a sick game of sorts, sending them incomprehensible ciphers and riddles that supposedly contained clues to his identity and the crimes within. Only one of his ciphers was ever solved, and the rest remain a mystery. The Riddler from the new Batman movie is a direct inspiration from the Zodiac's sinister dealings. For 5 years, the Zodiac would taunt his pursuers with riddles and codes, sending horrifying cards, taunts, a letter boldly displaying "My name is blank," and then a cipher below it teasing their inability to find him. A postcard with his symbol written in blood, amongst others. Part of what makes the Zodiac such a fascinating and truly horrifying case is how much he seems like a movie bad guy come to life. The planning makes him out to be some sort of sinister criminal mastermind, and it's hard to disagree with that proclamation when he's completely eluded any form of capture for the better part of 50 years. There were several possible suspects as to who the Zodiac could have been, but nothing conclusive. To date, people are still trying to find the answer, hoping something new might come up to put that nightmare to rest. And number 1, Jack the Ripper. If you want to talk about evil that's got some staying power, it's hard to top Whitechapel's most infamous resident ever. 134 years avoiding capture, which means he could still be out there. The 18th century Night Stalker has held an almost supernatural-like grip over public interest since we first ever heard about the case, surrounding the brutal 5 slayings we know about, who knows how many more. Preying on women and using the cover of the night, Jack eluded, stupefied, and taunted the streets of London, leaving a disgusting trail of blood and gore in his wake, leaving victims looking like the aftermath of a butcher's. He seemed to take a sickening glee in his violent delights, mocking his would-be pursuers, sending the police threatening letters, and even organs from his crimes. Jack is an almost modern mythical boogeyman, appearing across hundreds upon hundreds of works of fiction, TV shows, movies, video games, you name it. Assassin's Creed even tried to say he was part of the Order. That's a little out there. There are some folk who offer that Jack the Ripper is the progenitor to all true crime fascination, which honestly kinda makes sense. As much as he terrified Londoners at the time, the media was obsessed with him, with the original media buzz surrounding him, paralleling how we talk about most brutal crimes these days. You can bet your bottom pounds that if Jack was terrorizing London today, there'd be podcasters talking about him in between sponsored ads for MeUndies. Jack's crimes shocked Londoners, as the vicious and public nature of the slayings were not exactly commonplace. So surely, in 130 years, someone had to have some idea as to who Mr. the Ripper was, right? Well, with a case as famous as this, obviously there are some options. A quick glance at Jack's Wikipedia page suggests a possible 31 different suspects over the years who've all been attributed to it, and those are just the ones who made the page. It's worth noting that we are still looking, we are still trying to find him, put this case to rest, because everyone wants to be the one to say they unmasked the Ripper. Number 5, Frank Matthews. Our first spot is notorious criminal kingpin Frank Matthews, a legendary crime lord operating out of New York in the 1960s, who also had some pretty cool classic mafia names like Pee-wee and Black Caesar, built himself a criminal empire that Los Polos Hermanos would have been jealous of. Starting out small, working in racketeering and illegal gambling ops in Philly in the 1960s, he had his sights set on much bigger things, working his way up, collecting numbers, making contacts, until he could start selling product for some serious money. By the early 1970s, he was already trading millions of dollars for illegal narcotics, importing his stuff from Latin America and distributing it throughout the states. Pee-wee had his hands and pockets across the country, with his criminal web spanning across 21 states at its peak. Naturally, if you're moving that much stuff around the country with that many people involved in your operation, eventually somebody's gonna get wise, and that's exactly what happened. Boys in Blue tapped Frankie's phone communications and put out a federal bulletin for his arrest. By December 1972, Frank and his girlfriend were arrested at McCarran International in Vegas. Okay, so he got caught. This kind of breaks the list a little bit, but hear me out a little bit here. Because after spending a paltry couple months in jail, Frankie made bail and quickly got out of Dodge to literally never be seen again. Now, there is some discrepancy as to what happened. The FBI suspects that he was taken care of by a major New York crime family for fears he may turn witness. But they did also post a bounty, a $200,000 bounty for finding him, so they suspected he might still be out there. No trace of him was ever found, no body ever discovered, and his story went cold. Is he sleeping with the fishes, or did he return to pull strings from the shadows? Or maybe he pulled a Saul Goodman and started managing a Cinnabon in Omaha, living life on the lam. Man, that's 2 Breaking Bad references in one point. I gotta spread them out a little bit more. We got lots more than awkwardly wedging in Breaking Bad references on Top 5 Scary. We've got the best horror content on the web at least twice a day, every day, so hit subscribe and stay spooked. Number 4, The Pickler. You know, at first glance, this is not a particularly threatening nickname. It kinda sounds like the absolute lamest Z-tier excuse for a Batman villain that you'd throw in as a warm-up before, fighting the actual cool villain of that issue. Well, names can often be so deceiving because there really is not a lot that's funny about the Pickler once you understand why they called him that. He's maybe one of the most bizarre and macabre criminals I've ever read about. The Hungarian Bela Kiss lived in a small village near Budapest in the early 20th century. He lived with an elderly maid, but otherwise kept to himself, didn't have a tight circle of friends, but he did enjoy frequent female company. I mean, of course, with a name like Bela Kiss, makes sense. I gotta stop trying to make this guy sound cute, because I'm gonna regret it in like 1 second. In 1914, during the height of the First World War, Bela left to fight with his country. Now, wartime sometimes necessitates borrowing resources wherever you can, and the Hungarian army was short on gas. On Bela's isolated property were dozens upon dozens of oil barrels all conspicuously laid out in his yard. Someone alerted the soldiers and they went to go borrow borrow a cup or two, and were shocked to discover that upon cracking open the barrels were the bodies of several women floating in alcohol in a depraved attempt to preserve the corpses, hence where the foul nickname the Pickler came from. See, it's not nearly as funny once you know why they call him that. 20 barrels, 20 missing women. That's somehow not even the scariest, craziest part of this whole story. The women had punctures in their necks and were drained of blood, which sounds completely made up that this guy might also have been a vampire. Now, the Hungarian army moved to seize Bella immediately, but tracking him proved rather difficult, as he had a fairly common name and was also, he was in a war. Somehow, Bella was alerted that police had discovered his operation, and he left a corpse posing as himself in a military hospital and fled, never to be found again. Reported sightings popped up for a few years here and there. Allegedly, he moved to New York to begin a new life, but Bella eluded capture for the rest of his life. Unless he really was a vampire and is still out there, but I don't even want to entertain that possibility.
In at 3, Springfield 3. This name refers to an unsolved missing persons case that began on June 7th, 1992, following the disappearance of 3 people, Susanna Streeter, Stacy McCall, and Streeter's mother, Cheryl Levitt, after they went missing from the Levitt's home in Springfield, Missouri. All personal belongings were left behind, including wallets, purses, and cars. There was no sign of a struggle aside from a broken porch light. However, in 1997, Robert Craig Cox came forward claiming he knew the women had been murdered and that their bodies would never be recovered. Sadly, no remains were ever found. Coming in at 2, Flight MH370. Arguably one of the most famous unexplained disappearances of all time, MH370 was a scheduled international flight operated by Malaysia Airlines that disappeared on March 8, 2014, flying from Kuala Lumpur Airport to Beijing. The aircraft last made contact with air traffic control when it was over the South China Sea, less than an hour after takeoff, before completely disappearing from air traffic control radar screens. However, it was still tracked on military radar, which showed the plane deviating westward from its planned route and across the Malay Peninsula until leaving range of the military radar while over the Andaman Sea. The transponder was turned off manually and no phone calls or distress signals were ever sent out. To this day, no one knows what happened to the plane, not a single piece of wreckage was ever found. And lastly, in at number 1, Roanoke. The history of Roanoke is just plain baffling and one of the oldest unsolved mystery cases dating back to August 1587. The story goes that a group of English settlers arrived on Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina. During that same year, the governor of the colony, John White, sailed back to England to gather supplies. As he arrived there, a naval war had broken out between England and Spain, and Queen Elizabeth I called upon every available ship to fight the Spanish Armada. It wasn't until August 1590 that White was finally able to return to Roanoke. However, when he arrived, he found no trace of the colony or its inhabitants. There was only a single clue remaining to confirm there were people once there, at some point at least. In a wooden post, a single word was carved. It said Croatoan, the name of an island just south of Roanoke. That was the home to a Native American tribe by the same name. Theories go that the colony were perhaps abducted or even killed by the tribe. Other hypotheses are that they tried to sail back to England on their own accord but got lost, getting intercepted by the Spaniards and ultimately killed. Another is that they moved further inland, joining a friendly tribe. To this day, there are no definitive answers as to where the colony went. What do you guys think though?
Number 1. The Gurdon Light in Arkansas. Near a railroad in Arkansas flies an incredible unsolved mystery. Floating above and around the tracks, the bright light has been seen in many colors. Orange, blue, pink, green, you name it. Hundreds of people hike for hours in search of the railroad, hoping to see the light for themselves. The locals believe that the light is the ghost of a railroad worker, as the light resembles lanterns that workers used to carry around. This belief is further supported by the case of William McLean and Louis McBride. In 1931, William fired Louis, which led to Louis ending William's life. The reason behind Louis being fired is publicly disputed. Some people say that Louis had messed with part of the train track in such a way that a train may derail, while others say Louis had asked William for more hours and then was denied the request. Louis McBride later claimed that he had ended William's life after he'd been accused of tampering with the train tracks. Louis McBride was sentenced to the electric chair, and the glowing light made its first appearance shortly after. There have been several documentary crews hoping to reveal the mystery of the light. Even scientists have attempted to find the cause, but no theory has ever been proven. Some have attempted to say that it is merely highway lights, but According to historians, the light appeared before the highway lights did. Others have said that the light is made from underground crystals with extreme pressure being placed on them, causing them to charge and then release sparks. Neither theory has ever been confirmed. The light still glows to this day, and if you want to see it, head down to Arkansas on an overcast day and wait until nightfall. Then you may be fortunate enough to catch a glimpse of the Gurdon Light. Number 2. The Black Forest Haunting. Moving is a scary experience, but nobody ever thinks that it's going to be deadly. In the middle of a Colorado forest laid a secluded, fully furnished home. Alex Lee had just purchased it and was moving in with his children and wife. Unbeknownst to them, the previous owner failed to include haunted on the house's amenity list. The family began to experience strange occurrences, repugnant odors, flashing lights, and strange sounds. The family attributed these to random bad luck, but when shadowy figures began lurking in the forest, and the odor turned into a painful chemical burn that would tug at their throats, noses, and eyes, the family decided to take some action. They installed motion detectors, thinking that they were the victims of some annoying pranks from teens. But the motion detectors began to alert them even when seemingly nothing was there. The system had detected 62 break-ins, and the authorities had traveled to the home over 40 times, never finding any evidence of criminal activity. Steve Lee decided to install more cameras into the home, allowing him to see the beings. He caught random flashes of light, glowing orbs, and disconfigured creatures with faces. The family had once come home to all of their lights flashing, the sounds of footsteps on their roof, and orchestral music with rattling chains coming from the woods. Finally, the family realized they needed to find someone with expertise in the paranormal, so they called the hit supernatural sighting show, Sightings. The crew arrived and were greeted by the ghosts with the same amount of kindness the family had been, 0. The crew's cameras were knocked off of tripods, something attempted to possess a producer, and the medium declared that there were at least 20 spirits in the house. A shaman theorized that the house was built on top of a portal between two realms, living and dead, making it a hotspot for demonic entities to prowl. Though the spirits passing through weren't all necessarily harming the family or haunting them, they were passing through, which explains the multitude of disturbances. Others theorized that nothing supernatural was occurring at the home. Instead, they believed that it was the location of top secret government experiments. Steve Lee even claims to have seen uniformed and armored men lurking around the property.
Number 3. The Queen Mary. Now this next one is a beloved tourist spot. It's one of the most famous ships in the country, and there are few ships in the United States even half as haunted as the Queen Mary, a decommissioned ship that was converted into a hotel in Long Beach, California. It's stately, it's lush, it's got all the comfort and modern amenities of being a Navy man, bursting with restless spirits. The ship was christened in the mid-30s by the Queen Mary herself. That's why they named her that. And it was retired 3 decades later. It's since been converted into a hotel where guests can go and rent out a stateroom and pretend they're crossing the Atlantic in style. Now, there are a variety of spots inside the Queen Mary that are said to be congregation points for all things supernatural and strange. Perhaps if you know already anything about the Queen Mary, the most famous is Stateroom B340. Now, this was a problem before the place was even haunted. In 1948, a passenger, Walter J. Adamson, passed away in the room under unknown conditions. Nothing really came of this event until 1966, when a woman who was staying in B340 reported that she was woken up when the bed covers were pulled away and she saw a spectral man standing at the foot of her bed, and it was no room service. She screamed and rang for a steward, but as soon as the steward arrived to assess the situation, the man had vanished. Now, guests staying in this room claim they hear someone knock at the door in the middle of the night. The Mary's maids too complain that they find water running in B340 when no one's been in it in days. People have reported all kinds of ghosts around the pool as well. There's a woman in an old wedding gown people say they see, a young boy in a suit, a cloud of steam appearing out of nowhere, and then a girl in a blue and white dress who disappears in an instant, or maybe it's a gold and black dress, I'm not sure. Whatever the case, there's so many ghosts up in the Queen Mary, it's definitely worth checking out if you've got an EMF reader in your suitcase when you're going to California. Number 2. Griffith Park. Now, if you're a real avid cinephile, a student of the silver screen, perhaps you'd recognize Griffith Park for its use in a ton of Hollywood productions. The sprawling, rugged, mountainous set is home to a lot more than memorabilia for Hollywood. It's also said to be home to spirits and haunted by a century-old curse. It's said to have started all the way back in 1863, when Donna Petronilla, the niece of land baron Don Antonio Feliz, was cut out of her will. She was spurned and placed a hex on his land and cursed him for this indignation. She vowed that the land would never turn a profit for him, and that as long as he lived there, he would suffer misfortune until his untimely death, and anyone who was stupid enough to own the land afterward would get the same treatment. Now, local historians say the man who negotiated the ranch's rights was slain in a saloon duel, and the land's new owner was fatally struck by bandits in Mexico, so not looking good. A wealthy industrialist would end up buying up 4,000 acres of the land in the 1880s, but he ended up donating the land to the city of LA after strife and all sorts of malfeasances were causing problems with his ownership. He ended up striking his wife in a rampage. Now, she survived, but he went to prison for 2 years and passed away almost immediately after his release. Pretty suspicious, pretty strange. The landowners all died in rags, their reputation tarnished, and now that it's LA property, Griffith Park wasn't making anyone particularly rich. Was Donna Petronilla's curse that effective, or just a series of sheer coincidences? There are some who say Donna still watches over the land, ensuring her vengeance is carried out forever. Some visitors to Griffith Park claim that they see her spirit haunting the ground. Her vengeful ghost is said to appear as a lady in an all-white dress who materializes before locals for a moment. And number 1, Mount Shasta. Standing nearly 15,000 feet in the air, Mount Shasta is a beautiful peak. And, if you believe the legends, it could be home to some of the strangest thing in the entire country. Really, just about every conspiracy theory out there has been leveled to this mountain at one point. We got UFO sightings, strange disappearances, paranormal hauntings, a lost city, lizard people. If there is a conspiracy about something strange happening in California, the odds are good it'll eventually reach Mount Shasta. It's even true of GTA 5. You look up Mount Iliad, there's so many weird mysteries going on there. Virtual, real, it's everywhere. The history of mystery at the history of mystery. That rolls off the tongue beauty. The history of mystery. I'm gonna say that like 12 times. Sorry, editor. The history of mystery at Shasta goes back pretty far to the indigenous roots of the area. For the indigenous groups there, the mountain is a sacred place, sharing the territories of the Shasta, Wintu, Achimawai, Atsagewi, and Modoc, who all date their lineage back to when the mountain still erupted. Oh, it was a volcano. I kind of slid that under the door, but this thing used to like shoot lava. To the Modoc people, the mountain is home to the Gamakmak, the creator in their stories, and where the original bones of the Modoc people were first placed. Some observers still bring offerings to the mountain and to the old gods who are thought to reside over there. Tales of mythical creatures like Sasquatch are fairly common around the area and have been for years too, but like I said, that is just the tip of all the weirdness that's going on out here. One of the more interesting mysteries, and definitely the one I find most interesting, come out of Shasta is that of a lost city. There are some who speak of Lemuria, a theorized continent believed to have sunk over the Indian or Pacific Ocean. Theorists claim that some people survived this catastrophe and now the Lemurians live below Mount Shasta, presumably waiting until they can come and take over the earth, or maybe they're just chilling with advanced technology. Who's to say? This is where the lizard people come in, because there are people who believe that the Lemurians are actually the fabled lizard people. They live under Mount Shasta, and this is where they come to have meetings about what rap stars they're going to endorse to control the Illuminati. Of course, there's also the claims of UFO sightings. One particular flying saucer seen in February 2020 made rounds when a cloud in the sky looked exactly like a flying saucer, copying Jordan Peele's Nope. Officials denied it as just a lenticular cloud, but hey, take a look and decide for yourself, because it's definitely odd. So Mount Shasta, nothing but a good trail to hike up, or is it a home to a series of mysteries, bubbling and bursting, just waiting to erupt?
Coming in our number 5 spot, Boy in the Box. This is a case that takes place all the way back from February 23rd, 1957 in Philadelphia. A man was checking his muskrat traps in the woods when he noticed a little boy's lifeless body inside an abandoned bassinet. This man decided not to report what he found because of the fact that his muskrat traps were illegal, and he didn't want to get in trouble. Then 2 days later, a college student named Frederick Boyce came across the same body, and he told police about it the next day. This little boy was left completely naked, and his hands and feet were wrinkled as if he had been submerged in water before he died. Also, upon inspection, it was revealed that his esophagus contained a dark substance, suggesting that he might have vomited right before he died. The investigators also discovered the little boy was hit in the head with something several times. This case drew in a lot of media attention, but no one ever came forward to identify this boy. A sketch was even drawn up to show what this boy looked like when he was alive. He became known as the boy in the box as well as America's unknown child. So for many, many years, the case was just sitting there with no leads. But then in 2002, some progress was made when a psychiatrist claimed a patient of hers named Mary confided that her parents had bought America's unknown child and used him as a sex toy. Mary said that her mother was bathing the boy when he started throwing up. Mary's mother got so angry that she beat him to death. Mary then said that she helped her mother put his dead body in a box and helped carry him out to the woods and then left him there. The police did believe Mary. However, when the press got a hold of her name, she left the country and no further efforts were made into investigating this case. So yes, Mary was unstable, but her story sounds pretty believable to me. Do you guys think she was telling the truth? Let me know down below. And at number 4, Elizabeth Short. Back in 1947, the dismembered body of a woman was discovered in a vacant lot in Los Angeles. The body was found completely drained of blood. Also, her face was slashed from her mouth to her ear. She was also posed with her hands placed over her head, her elbows were bent, and her legs were spread. Her intestines were also cut and tucked underneath her butt. Obviously, the authorities were called, and then they identified the body as Elizabeth Short, who was a 22-year-old aspiring actress who, at the time, was dating a married salesman. 9 days after the body was discovered, a weird envelope was sent to the Los Angeles Examiner and the Los Angeles papers. The envelope contained Short's birth certificate, pictures, and some of her personal belongings. Then 2 days later, another letter was sent. This letter included a time and location where the killer would show up to meet the police. So the police went to this place at the time the killer said, but no one ever showed up. The same day, the police received another note saying, "Have changed my mind, you would not give me a square deal." This killing was justified. To this day, no one knows who killed this woman, and it's said to be one of the most baffling unsolved murder cases in history.
Number 3. UFO sighting. In December 29, 1980, Betty Cash saw something on the outskirts of Houston near Dayton that would change the course of her life forever, as she made a close encounter of the third kind. She was driving her friend Vicki Landrum and Landrum's grandson home one night at 9 p.m. when the three of them noticed a bright light in the sky. Betty Cash described it like this: "We didn't know what it was, but we knew there was something that was lighting up the sky. We all began to feel heat, and all of a sudden Vicki screamed for me to stop. When I stopped, I went forward and her handprint was embedded in the dash of the car, and I thought, well, I've got to see what this is. So I got out, I walked towards the front of the car, and I stood there looking up, trying to figure out what this object was. Then a diamond-shaped object appeared with flames shooting out. The heat was tremendous. When I reached for the door handle, the door was so hot I couldn't even begin to open it. The only thing I was thinking was, are we gonna get out of here alive? And then seemingly as soon as it appeared, it disappeared, and Landrum stated that moments later, a large squadron of black helicopters soared over the area. After the choppers cleared, Betty took the Landrums home and retired for the night. The next morning, however, Cash said she was extremely sick, suffering from nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, weakness, and an intense burning in her eyes. Now here's where things get curious. Landrum and her grandson all reported the exact same symptoms. Over the next few days, Cash said her symptoms worsened so much, with large blisters forming on her skin, she eventually had to be taken to a hospital where she was treated for radiation poisoning, and she lost large patches of skin and clumps of hair. To date, there has never been a conclusive answer to what happened to Cash and Landrum. The US government denied any involvement and said they don't have any diamond-shaped crafts like that in their fleet, and it wasn't from their government. Was the military testing new technology on unsuspecting victims? Was it a craft from another world touching down for a moment? There are so few answers and so many questions for this unsolved mystery. Number 2. The death fields. There is a stretch of I-45 highway between Houston and Galveston that is notorious to locals due to the string of violent, horrific crimes that have all occurred there since the 1970s. Since the first body was discovered, it's been thought that anywhere from 33 bodies have been discovered there, and the truly horrifying thing is how little police and authorities seem to have on this case. Initially, detectives believed that this work was that of a serial killer, due to the sheer number of bodies being found in the area, but over time some have wondered if it could be multiple criminals. Most of the victims have been young women, typically around college ages. The FBI has said that the agency's behavioral experts have created a profile of a possible killer, but there are no known witnesses to any of the crimes and no common person to connect them all. An official statement that was given by the FBI said that the signs point to one killer, although multiple killers can't be ruled out. Given the nature of the area where the bodies were found, it was likely someone with roots in the area, someone who would have known these fields were a good place to hide a body. In 1998, a man named Edward Howard Bell was arrested and claimed to have been involved in the deaths of 11 girls in Galveston County. And although he was a suspect in the aforementioned I-45 case, police unfortunately didn't have enough evidence to tie him to those larger crimes. Only one death on the I-45 was ever convicted, when Louisiana police arrested Kevin Edison Smith in 2009 on a completely unrelated charge. A DNA test found that it matched the body of a girl who had disappeared from Texas in 1996 and whose body was tragically found on the I-45. From this confession and conviction from two different criminals, it's suspected that multiple people were involved in these grisly crimes. Hopefully one day this case can be closed for good and the I-45 can go back to just being a highway. And number 1, the Servant Girl Annihilator. Perhaps one of the most infamous criminals to ever live in Austin, and to this day is still anonymous and possibly will forever. The Servant Girl Annihilator, absolutely brutally named, I cannot believe they called him that, was a serial killer who preyed on young women in Austin between 1884 and 85. He is thought by some to be America's first serial killer, hardly a badge of honor if you ask me. He attacked wantonly, and despite his name, he was not exclusively targeting women. He fatally attacked 7 women, 1 man, and additionally seriously injured 6 women and 2 men. All of his victims he would attack indoors while asleep and then would finish the job outside, leaving them to be found. His victims were all posed in similar manners and were all found with a sharp object inserted into their ears. Texan lawman started a manhunt for the criminal, arresting 400 men in the year of 85 in a desperate attempt for any leads on who was terrorizing the community. Interestingly, the top theory of elected officials at the time is that the Servant Girl Annihilator couldn't possibly have been committing all of these crimes by himself as one lone deranged criminal, but rather an identity shared by a group of men carrying out heinous acts all together. Now, in the end, no one was ever successfully accused of being the Servant Girl Annihilator. And what happened to him was additional police patrols and civilian militias around Austin ended up scaring the Annihilator off. Or so you think. A theory, although an outlandish one, is that the Servant Girl Annihilator would move to London to continue his crimes, as 3 years later, the Whitechapel killings would start and Jack the Ripper would terrorize the streets of London, leading to some people suspecting that maybe these 2 lunatics were connected in a way. Think about that, a globe-trotting serial killer wasn't content with just one, had to move, get 2 different scary nicknames. Imagine if both your nicknames were Servant Girl Annihilator and Jack the Ripper. A little much for one guy, if you ask me. Number 5, D.B. Cooper. One of the most infamous disappearance cases in history, and I'm gonna be honest, probably my personal favorite unsolved mystery of all time. If you haven't heard the story of the real-life daredevil heister, Mr. D.B. Cooper, you're in for a treat and then some. Depending on your definition of success, you could argue D.B. Cooper might be the most successful criminal in history, since not only did he get off with quite an impressive take, but he got away with all his crimes and avoided capture, if he's still alive, that is. On November 24th, 1971, a man using an alias of Dan Cooper walked up to the ticket counter at Portland International and booked a one-way ticket to Seattle, claiming that he was on business. He was technically correct in that assessment. Once on board the plane, Cooper passed a note to a flight attendant, and he was not asking for an extra bag of peanuts and fluffing his pillow. No, he was just letting the attendant know that he had brought a bomb on board the flight and demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. And if he caught a whiff of any funny business, he'd turn this plane into a national tragedy on the 6 o'clock news, see? So, you know, nothing unreasonable really. I make all those demands whenever I'm hangry, pretty normal stuff. So the plane landed in Seattle, as originally planned, and authorities were summoned to deliver the ransom money and parachutes to Cooper. The passengers were relieved and eventually let go, but the flight crew was stuck with their new boss, Mr. Cooper, who'd taken them hostage. Cooper seized the plane, planning a flight path to Mexico City, but midway through the flight, Cooper, who was a huge fan of the film Point Break and wanted to pay homage to it, jumped out of a plane with all of the money. D.B. Cooper jumping out of that plane with a suitcase full of money would be the last time anyone ever saw him. He jumped out of that plane and into the stuff of history book legends, the Hall of Fame of heisters. Move over, Payday crew, this guy's got you beat. Despite extensive searching, not a hair of DB Cooper ever turned up. Some speculate rather bluntly that perhaps he miscalculated the angle and splattered somewhere across the northwest and the heist wasn't as impressive as we thought, while others imagined that he got off easy, he's knocking back Mai Tais on a Hawaiian island, enjoying the spoils of his loot. But who was the guy to begin with? A career crook on one last job? Someone trying it out? Someone snapping? Several theories suggest he was ex-military, special forces, which would explain his proficiency. In fact, the leading hypothesis is that he was ex-military. We may never know who the real DB Cooper is, and that's fine. That's the way he'd want it. And if we don't know who he is, it makes it that much more fun for us. He could be any one of us. He could be you, he could be me, he could be... I'll stop talking there. And if you're looking for more scary videos and strange stories out there, we've got all of that and then some. If you can think it up, we've probably done a video or two on it. We've got quite the catalog. So click on through, hit subscribe, and please tickle that little bell and make sure you don't miss a single scream. But would you kindly do that at the end of this video? Because I got 4 more missing persons cases ready for you now. Number 4, the Mary Celeste. Our next mysterious case is a bit of an outlier, a little bit of a cheat. I know. It's not just one person going missing, it's an entire ship. How does that happen? December 1872, the captain of the Mary Celeste, one Benjamin Briggs, cast off to New York to travel to Italy for unknown reasons, but probably for the tomatoes. The ship was kept to a rather tight crew. A staff of 8, plus Briggs's wife and daughter, were enough to man the vessel. The voyage seemed like it went pretty well until another vessel, the Del Gratia, came into contact with the Celeste and were chilled at what they'd found when they recovered the ship drifting aimlessly. As rescuers boarded the ship, they were greeted with a maritime mystery to forever haunt them. The ship seemed to be in perfect working order, no signs of damage or distress. Had it not been found freely floating, they'd assumed the ship was just built. Aside from a single lifeboat missing, the ship was in good condition, the hold stocked with food and water. The crew's personal belongings were scattered about. The table was set for a meal, as if the crew had been minutes away from breaking bread. So what happened? What reasonable captain would abandon a perfectly serviceable, well-stocked ship? Well, reasonable explanations were offered, theories of piracy or mutiny prevailing. Now, the ship being relatively untouched does call into question the notion of piracy, as I don't know how much you know about pirates, but they didn't tend to leave the rum behind if there is any. Any pirate captain worth his salt would have plundered that thing down to the floorboards. And there didn't appear to be any struggle at all, so no forceful evacuation, nobody kicked them off the ship. So with rationale out of the way, we've nowhere left to turn but blind and wild speculation. Theories of supernatural beings, cursed gold, vengeful spirits, sea monsters, Davy Jones. Take your pick of whatever nautical bedtime story you think could have overtaken the Mary Celeste. You know what? Let me know down below. I love pirate ghost stories more than anything. Perhaps it was a bit of sea madness, cabin fever. Maybe it's whatever happened to those 2 guys in the lighthouse happened to them here. No matter how you slice it, the vanishing of the Mary Celeste is a head scratcher of a mystery. More lost souls to the darkness that lurks below the ocean's water. Wary yourselves against the whispers that echo the seas, for the spirits of the Mary Celeste may still be watching, eager to claim another.
Number 3, the mystery ships of the Great Lakes. Everybody knows about the Bermuda Triangle swallowing ships and planes, but the mystery ships of the Great Lakes is a less known and equally perplexing mystery. Dating all the way back to the 1700s, thousands of ships are assumed to have disappeared or met their demise while traveling across the lakes. To many minds, the ground amount of sinkings is a result of the dangerous weather conditions that the lake provides, and there is no further mystery behind it. But the disappearances are where curious minds begin to wonder that it may not have been so simple. Since the 1700s, boats have traversed the waters of the Great Lakes. They were excellent sources of freshwater, fish, and natural resources. The lakes had powerful winds, which propelled the boats forward, providing sailors with a fast way to arrive at their destination. And since the 1800s, ships have been sinking and disappearing. without a trace. In 1881, the ship of Thomas Hume disappeared. In 1921, the Rosabelle was found floating upside down, empty of all passengers. It looked as though the Rosabelle had collided with another ship, but no other ship was ever recovered, and the cause of the wreckage was never found. Lake Michigan has a space known as the Michigan Triangle, and, like the Bermuda Triangle, it is known as a hotspot for sinking planes and ships. In the 1940s, over 120 planes crashed and sank into Lake Michigan. About 40 of them were recovered. In 1950, a commercial flight flying over Lake Michigan, carrying over 50 people, had a small bout of turbulence before completely disappearing. Over 70 years later, the flight has still not been found. Number 4. The Lost Lemon Mine. One of the most interesting mysteries of the Canadian Rockies is the Lost Lemon Mine. There are many different versions of the story, ranging from insanity, curses, and killing, to outlaws, massacres, and robberies. No matter the differences of the story's specifics, all tales share an agreement on the most crucial piece of information. Somewhere in the Canadian Rockies is a lost gold mine. Many people have scoured the Rockies in search for the elusive mine that promises bouts of fortune and riches, but almost all of their expeditions have ended in horrific tragedies. The first expedition in the search of the mine took place in spring of 1870 with two men, known as Lemon and Blackjack. The two men eventually came across a face of the mountains that was covered in solid gold. The men began to argue over whether they should take the gold now or return in a warmer season for it. Blackjack grew tired of the disagreement and fell asleep, but Lemon stayed awake, tossing and turning with anger. In a rage of fury, Lemon took his partner's life with an axe and began to hear noises coming from the woods. Lemon grew fearful that his partner was haunting him, and so he left the mountains in an attempt to escape the torment. Lemon searched for the mine for years, but the further into the mountains he went, the more voices and torment he endured, which always caused him to turn around and leave. Many people heard about the mine that Lemon and Blackjack found, yet every expedition to locate it came back empty-handed or insane. The Lost Lemon Mine remains unlocated to this day. Some question if the mine ever even existed, or if Lemon had simply gone insane and imagined it. Either way, if you find yourself longing to climb some mountains, consider heading over to the Rockies. Who knows, you may even find some gold. Number 5. The Black Flash of Provincetown. In 1939, a group of children returned home, terrified, claiming to have seen a creature leaping after them from the sand dunes. The parents took this as a case of overactive imaginations, but little did they know, the creature the children saw would begin to strike fear into the heart of their small town. Reports of this creature began pouring in, people claiming to see it standing and watching them. It chased after them, laughing as people screamed, fearing for their lives. The creature was given many names: the Devil of the Dunes, the Provincetown Phantom, but the name that stuck was the Black Flash, as it highlighted how impossibly fast the creature was capable of moving. The Black Flash hasn't caused any physical damage to the citizens of the town. The creature's only goal seemed to be terrifying the residents. People theorized as to what the Black Flash could be: a pranking student, a reincarnation of a similar monster, or just a collective town joke that they all agreed on. The police claimed that they had located the perpetrators behind the Black Flash, but decided to keep the identity a secret. The creature did indeed disappear, showing that there may have been some truth to the police catching the perpetrators, but many questions still lingered in the residents' minds.